The first report arrived on a Tuesday, though no one in the northern garrison would remember the day of the week for very long afterward. What they remembered was the quiet. Not the ordinary quiet of a cold morning in the borderlands where frost sat on the grass and sound simply traveled less willingly through thin air. This was something deliberate. A shape pressed into the world. The patrol had gone north along the old road that ran between two hills of brown stone. 7 mages, all ranked, all carrying detection arrays tuned to magical residue. Standard procedure for a borderland sweep. They had done it before dozens of times, and the most dramatic thing they had ever found was a nest of corrupted forest sprites that had wandered too far from their natural range. 7 mages for a sprite nest was excessive, which was precisely why the association had stopped assigning fewer. They did not come back. What came back instead was one man, a junior scout, who had not been with the patrol proper, but had been trailing 200 meters behind to log waypoints. He arrived at the garrison gate at dusk, walking steadily, which struck the gate guards as strange, because his face suggested he should have been running. He sat down in the duty room, accepted a cup of water, and told them the road simply ended. Not physically. The stone was still there, the grass still grew, the hills still rose on either side. But at a certain point, the patrol had walked forward, and then they had not been there anymore. No flash, no sound, no residue on his detection slate. The garrison commander sent 2 more mages to verify. She did not send them alone. She sent them with a rope tied between them, and a 3rd mage holding the other end 50 meters back. The rope went slack after 11 minutes. No jerk, no sudden pull at the end held by the 3rd mage, only a soft release, as though the rope had been handed back from the other side. She sealed the gate, wrote a report in shorthand she had not used since her field certification, and dispatched a courier to the nearest association chapter house by morning. The report reached Fern 3 days later in a town called Reimer's Crossing, where she and Frieren had stopped to resupply, and Stark had eaten an unreasonable quantity of bread. Fern read it standing at the counter of the chapter house, turning the page once then again, and then folding it with a precision that suggested she was managing something she did not intend to show on her face. "There is no magical residue at all?" she asked the chapter clerk, a middle-aged woman who had clearly been hoping the report would be someone else's problem. None that the initial sweep picked up. The commander's note says the detection slates were functioning correctly before the patrol entered, after they could not get close enough to check. Could not, or chose not to. The clerk paused. The report reads, "could not." The commander's phrasing is careful. Fern set the paper down on the counter. She looked at it for a moment, as if it owed her an explanation, then picked it up again, and went to find Frieren. Frieren was outside, sitting on a stone wall with her silver hair pulled loosely over one shoulder, watching a cat navigate the gap between 2 market stalls with the focused attention she usually reserved for unusual spell structures. She turned when she heard Fern's footsteps on the cobblestone, which meant she had noticed them well before that. There is an anomaly in the north. Fern crossed to where Frieren sat. 9 mages missing, no trace, no residue. The garrison has sealed access. Ainz. Frieren tilted her head. No residue at all. That is what the report confirms. For a moment, Frieren was quiet. Then she slid off the wall, and the cat took the opportunity to disappear into a crate of turnips, and she held out her hand for the paper. She read it the way she read most things that interested her, slowly and without comment, until she reached the end. The detection slates found nothing to interact with. Frieren handed the paper back. The report says the mages could not approach closely enough to confirm. That is not what I mean. Frieren folded the paper and handed it back. A slate fails when there is too much residue or when something actively suppresses the signal. Either way, it leaves a mark interference saturation, some kind of impression. What leaves nothing at all is something the detection system has no category for, something it cannot ask a question about. She looked north, though north from Reimer's crossing was just a baker's chimney and a stretch of gray sky. That is different. They left the next morning. Stark, upon being told the broad shape of the situation, asked 3 practical questions about road conditions, food availability, and whether the missing mages were likely to still be alive. He received uncertain answers to all 3, and seemed to find this less alarming than Fern had expected. He had been traveling with Frieren long enough to understand that uncertainty was not the same as danger, even if it sometimes preceded it. The road north took 2 days. On the first day, they passed through villages that still felt ordinary, with wood smoke and dogs and children who stared at Frieren's staff. On the second day, the villages had a different quality. Not empty, not abandoned, but careful. Doors were closed. People moved with the particular efficiency of those who have decided that their errands are finished for today. An innkeeper in the last settlement before the garrison road told them without being asked that he had not seen anyone come down from the north in over a week. They went up. The innkeeper kept wiping the counter with a cloth that had already done its work. Soldiers, mages from the chapter. Nobody came back down, not injured, not walking, not anything. And you stayed. Stark set his cup down. It was not an accusation. This is my inn. The man set the cloth down as if that settled the matter, and perhaps it did. The association's perimeter came into view at mid-morning on the 3rd day. It was a serious construction, a line of wooden posts with detection threads strung between them, at 3 heights, a cleared field on either side, and a checkpoint tent where 2 mages in gray coats sat with slates and a record ledger. Behind the tent, further up the road toward the hills, a larger camp had taken shape. Canvas structures, supply lines, a communication tower that had not been there long enough for the ropes to weather properly. The checkpoint mages recognized Fern's coat insignia and let the group through without delay. Though one of them looked at Frieren's staff with an expression that suggested he had heard the name before and was revising something in his head. The camp commander, a lean woman named Holt, who wore her gray coat like a decision she had made long ago and not revisited, gave them the situation in 3 sentences. 9 mages missing 7 from the original patrol, 2 from the verification team sent to confirm. Garrison perimeter sealed. No residue, no visible boundary, no response to communication spells sent into the affected area. Has anyone physically approached the boundary? Fern asked. Twice. The first attempt, we lost the approach team. The second attempt, we tethered them. The rope went slack. At what distance? Approximately 400 meters from the boundary marker, we measured the rope length afterward. Holt paused. The rope did not break. It went slack, as if there was no tension on the other end. The tent was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the camp ropes and made the only sound worth noting. And the boundary marker. Frieren spoke for the first time since they had entered. Who placed it? Holt looked at her. The second approach team before we lost contact. So the boundary could have moved since then. The commander's expression did not change, but something behind it shifted the way ice shifts before it decides what to do. A pause long enough to mean she had not considered that and was now considering it very seriously. Yes, it could have. That evening, Fern stood at the edge of the cleared perimeter and held her detection slate level. The reading was clean, no residue, no suppression field, no anomalous mana signature of any kind. The slate was functioning. There was simply nothing for it to find. She moved it slowly across the arc of her view from the tree line on the left to the stone hills on the right, and the reading did not change. She had seen residue null zones before, They occurred after certain high-order spells burned out their medium, or occasionally in natural formations, where mana flow had been disrupted by geology over long periods. Both types had a quality she could identify, a kind of negative impression, like the outline of something that had been there and was now gone. This had no outline. It was not the absence of magic. It was the absence of the question. She lowered the slate. Behind her, Stark was sitting on a supply crate, silent, which was how she knew he had noticed it too. Frieren. Frieren was 3 meters to her left, looking at the same stretch of unremarkable terrain. She did not answer immediately. Something is here. Frieren's voice carried no particular weight, the tone she used when stating a fact that had not yet decided what kind of fact it wanted to be. It is not hiding. It simply does not produce the kind of signal we know how to look for. She turned and walked back toward the camp without hurrying, her staff clicking once against a stone in the path. Fern looked north for another few seconds. The hills sat where they had always sat. The road ran up between them and disappeared around a bend that had not looked significant before today in any way. She followed Frieren back. Neither of them slept well that night, though neither mentioned it in the morning.
Crazy to read. You guys could imagine just walking down a normal road and poof, you are completely gone without a single trace. What really caught my attention is how Frieren figured out the magic radar was not broken. The zone did not hide the magic, it just deleted the whole concept of it. That is such a terrifying power flex right off the bat. Who do you guys think is actually controlling this silent zone? Drop your theories in the comments below, because things are about to get even wilder in the next part.
Sari arrived at the northern camp on the morning of the 4th day since Holt had sealed the road 2 days earlier than anyone had requested, and 3 days earlier than anyone had expected. She came without announcement, without an escort worth mentioning, and with the particular quality of stillness that very old mages sometimes carried. Not calm exactly, but the kind of settled weight that made a room rearrange itself around her, without anyone noticing they had moved. She was shorter than her reputation suggested. Her hair was pale gold, her eyes the color of dry grass in late autumn, and she wore a white coat over a traveling outfit that would not have looked out of place on a junior researcher. The red cloak was folded over one arm. She had not put it on. Holt met her at the edge of the command tent and gave her the report without preamble, which Sari seemed to appreciate, or at least did not penalize. The communication spells. Sari waited until Holt had finished before continuing. You sent them into the affected area. 3 times. Standard contact arrays, 1 high-order relay. And Holt considered the question for a moment. They transmitted. We confirmed the signal left our end correctly, but there was no interaction on the receiving side. Not blocked, not absorbed. The spells simply arrived at a space that did not acknowledge them. She paused. Like sending a letter to an address that does not refuse mail. It simply has no slot. Sari turned to look north. The hills were the same gray-brown they had been for 1,000 years. The road ran up between them, unchanged. How many more personnel were you planning to send in before I arrived? She asked. Holt's jaw tightened slightly. 1 more tethered team, to attempt a further approach with a longer line and a mana anchor. Cancel it. Commander. We do not feed the unknown. Sari's voice did not rise. It was the tone of a woman who had long since stopped needing volume to make a point. Every person who enters that area without us understanding the mechanism is a person we cannot account for, cannot retrieve, and cannot learn from. 9 missing is a data problem. 18 missing is waste. She finally looked away from the hills. What we know is already enough to tell us we are not equipped to proceed the way we have been proceeding. So we stop proceeding that way. The camp absorbed this instruction over the course of the morning. Orders moved through the duty structure with the quiet efficiency of an organization that had learned not to argue with Sari on matters she had already decided. The planned third approach was stood down. The detection perimeter was extended laterally by 200 meters on each side, adding coverage rather than depth. 2 senior analysts were pulled from other assignments and brought north by relay horse. Frieren watched this reorganization from the edge of the cleared field, standing where she had stood the night before with her slate. She had come out at dawn before Frieren was awake and run another sweep. The reading had not changed. Whatever occupied the space beyond the hills had the same relationship to her instruments that a river had. To a map drawn on paper, the map was not wrong exactly, but it was describing something from a tradition the river had never participated in. She had written 3 lines of notes and then stopped because the notes were accurate and useless in equal measure. There was one thing she had not written down. During the second pass, the location beacon, she carried a standard issue tracker linked to the paired beacons each field mage wore, had registered a faint response from inside the affected area. Not a message, not a position lock. Just a single pulse, the kind a beacon produced when it was still attached to someone breathing before the signal dropped entirely. She had run the check 3 more times and gotten nothing, but once was enough to change the calculation. Stark found her there an hour later, carrying 2 cups of something warm from the camp kitchen. He handed her one without asking if she wanted it, which she did, and stood beside her looking north. The people who went in. Stark looked north, not at her. You think they're alive? The evidence suggests it. No remains, no residue from a combat event, no scattered equipment. She wrapped both hands around the cup. If something had destroyed them, there would be traces. High-order spells leave material signatures even when they're designed not to. The absence of any trace is more consistent with containment than elimination. She paused. And this morning, one of the location beacons returned a single pulse. Faint. Gone before I could pin it. But it was there. Stark was quiet for a moment. That's not necessarily better. No, Frieren agreed, but it changes the options available to us. 400 meters beyond where the detection threads ended, in a space that Friern's slate would have registered as simply not there, a man named Aldrich was sitting on a stone floor, trying to understand why he was not afraid. He was afraid in the technical sense. His hands were unsteady, and he had not slept, and every time he heard footsteps in the corridor outside the room he had been placed in, his chest did something unpleasant. But the fear was not the overwhelming kind. It was the manageable kind that came from being treated with a precision that felt paradoxically more reassuring than cruelty would have been. Whatever held him here was not interested in harm for its own sake. It was interested in information. The room was clean. The light was steady. He had been given water and something that tasted like food. No one had threatened him. The questions, when they came, were delivered by a presence he had difficulty looking at directly, something about the shape of it or the way it occupied space. And they were not questions about weaknesses or vulnerabilities. They were questions about structure. How does your association assign mage ranks? Who authorizes a perimeter seal at the regional level? Are there individuals whose authority supersedes the standard chain of command? Aldrich was a 4th-rank field mage who had spent 11 years doing borderland sweeps. He was not by any definition an important man. He understood with a clarity that the precise quality of the questions gave him that this was exactly why he had been chosen to answer first. In the chamber that served as Nazarik's operational center for the current situation, a room that had been repurposed with the same quiet efficiency as everything else in the tomb, Demiurge set down his notes and considered what he had. The man Aldrich had been cooperative, which was expected. People of his rank usually were when the alternative was made sufficiently clear without ever being stated directly. More useful than his answers, however, was the shape of what he did not know. A field mage of 11 years could describe the association structure accurately up to a certain level and then grew vague not from deception, but from genuine ignorance. That boundary was itself data. It told Demiurge exactly how much the lower ranks were trusted, with which was less than their commanders believed and more than their commanders would have wanted. The individual named Seri. Demiurge addressed the room, rather than either of them specifically, since Albedo was reading a secondary report and Ainz was standing near the far wall in the way he sometimes stood when he was thinking through something he had not yet decided to share. She was mentioned 3 times by different subjects, always in the same register. Not as a superior to be appeased, as a variable to be accounted for. Meaning, Albedo asked without looking up. Meaning the rank and file do not obey her out of institutional obligation. They account for her the way one accounts for weather. He tapped the edge of his notes with one finger. She reads people, evaluates them, makes determinations that the rest of the structure then adapts to. If she arrives at the northern camp and she will given what we have observed of how the association responds to anomalies of this scale, then the negotiation, when it happens, will effectively be with her. Ainz had not moved. The red light in the depths of his eye sockets did not change in quality or direction. This was not indifference. It was the particular stillness of a mind running through a sequence it had not yet finished. We continue as we are. Ainz turned from the wall at last. No contact, no signals. Nothing that tells them the boundary of our awareness. They will not attack while they believe their people might still be alive inside. That gives us time. Use it. Albedo set down the report. We could accelerate the process. A single demonstration. No. The word was quiet. We are not in a position to make demonstrations we cannot fully control the consequences of. We don't know what this world's response thresholds look like yet. We don't know who else is watching. He walked toward the door, unhurried. Demiurge, I want everything you can extract from the current subjects completed within 2 days. After that, we assess. Demiurge inclined his head. Of course, Ainz-sama. The door closed. Albedo looked at the place where Ainz had been standing, then back at her report. He's already 3 moves ahead. Albedo did not look up from where Ainz had been standing. She was not addressing Demiurge and did not appear to require a response. Demiurge, who had privately reached the same conclusion by a somewhat longer route, agreed completely and kept it to himself. And the day ended at the northern camp with a meeting that Seri did not chair so much as occupy. She sat at the head of the map table, listened to 3 senior mages present their current theories about the anomaly's nature, and then asked 4 questions that caused 2 of the 3 to revise their theories on the spot, and the third to go quiet in the particular way that meant he was deciding whether to agree or to admit he did not know. Frieren was present at the back of the tent, not because she had been summoned, but because Holt had looked at her when the meeting was announced and left the rest unspoken, which Frieren had correctly interpreted as an invitation. She watched Seri work through the room with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this for longer than the tent had existed. Not brutal, not dismissive, simply accurate in the way that a very sharp edge was accurate. It did not damage more than was necessary. But what it touched completely. After the meeting, as people filtered out, Seri remained at the table. She was looking at the map. The northern hills were marked on it in brown. The road in a thin black line, the boundary marker, as a small red X that everyone in the room had been careful not to stare at for too long. You have a theory. Seri had not looked up from the map. Fern, who had been the last to move toward the exit, stopped. Several. Give me the one you haven't told anyone else. Fern considered this for 3 seconds, which was longer than she usually needed. Whatever is there did not arrive recently. The way it sits in the space, there's no displacement, no edge effect, no sense that it pushed anything aside when it came. It occupies that ground the way a mountain occupies ground, as if it has simply always been the correct thing to be in that location. She paused. I don't think we're dealing with something that moved into our territory. I think we're dealing with something that decided our territory was now adjacent to it. The tent was quiet. Outside, a camp cook was clanging something metallic in a way that seemed deeply inappropriate to the conversation. Sari looked at her for a moment with the evaluative attention she gave to things that had earned a second thought. Go get some rest. It was not dismissal. It was Fern understood as she stepped out into the cold evening air, something closer to provisional approval, the kind that came without announcement and could be revoked just as quietly. She walked back toward the sleeping tent and did not look north because she had already looked north enough times today to understand that looking again would not tell her anything new. The hills sat in the dark the same way they sat in the light. What was behind them had not moved. Or if it had done so in a way that left no indication of direction. That she decided was almost certainly the point. Frieren reached the northern camp 3 days after Sari, which put her arrival at the tail end of a reorganization that had already settled into its new shape. The checkpoint mages waved the group through without much ceremony. Fern's insignia and the staff with its curved blade and red orb were both recognizable enough that the guards spent more energy on not staring than on procedure. The camp was larger than Fern had described in her brief account the previous evening. Tents had been added along the eastern edge. A second supply line ran parallel to the first, and someone had erected a low wooden barrier between the sleeping quarters and the command area that served no defensive purpose, but made the space feel more deliberately organized. It was the kind of modification that happened when a temporary camp began to suspect it was not temporary. Sari was at the map table when they arrived, studying something that was not the map. It was a transcription lines of notation Fern recognized as atmospheric mana readings, taken at intervals along the perimeter. Sari did not look up. You felt it from Reimer's Crossing, she said. Not a question. The concealment was wrong, Frieren replied. She set her staff against the tent pole and looked at the map anyway out of habit. Not suppressed, not layered. Whatever is up there doesn't produce the kind of presence I know how to read. That's unusual enough to notice. How unusual, Frieren considered this with the patience of someone who had been asked imprecise questions for a very long time. I've encountered things I couldn't read before. Ancient formations collapse the spell structures areas where mana had pooled and stagnated over centuries. All of those had a texture. She traced the edge of the map without touching it. This has none. It's as if the space decided to stop participating in the question. Sari set down her notation sheet. For the first time, she looked at Frieren directly, with the particular attention she reserved for things that had said something worth filing, and then passed her briefly at Stark, who was standing just inside the tent entrance and doing a reasonable job of appearing at ease. No demonstrations, Sari said, addressing all 3 of them equally. No uncontrolled test spells, no blind probes, no volunteers. If you cannot articulate what you expect to learn before you attempt it, you don't attempt it. Understood? Stark glanced at Fern. Fern said nothing, which he correctly interpreted as agreement. The experiment Frieren proposed that afternoon was small enough that Sari approved it without visible hesitation, which was itself a form of approval Fern had not expected to receive so quickly. The object was a smooth river stone roughly the size of a fist, with a tracking sigil inscribed on its flat underside, the kind of sigil used to locate lost equipment in the field. Simple enough that a second-year apprentice could cast it. Durable enough that it would persist through minor magical interference. Frieren had taken it from the camp supply kit, without asking which Fern decided not to address. They stood at the edge of the cleared perimeter 12 meters back from the point where the detection threads ran out. The boundary marker, a wooden stake with a strip of orange cloth, was another 40 meters ahead, which meant it was within the affected area and had been since the second approach team placed it and then vanished. Frieren crouched and rolled the stone forward. It crossed the detection thread line, moved another 2 meters across the ground, and stopped. Not because anything blocked it. The terrain was level. It stopped at the same point each time, regardless of how hard she rolled it. A consistency that had nothing to do with friction or gradient. She tried twice more to confirm it before standing. Fern checked her slate. The tracking sigil was still active. She could read its signal clearly. But the stone's position registered as uncertain. Not missing, not blocked. The sigil was returning a location, but the location had no coordinates she could map. "It's still there," she said. "Yes." Frieren had not moved. She was watching the stone with the same focused attention she'd given the cat in Reimer's Crossing. The sigil works. The stone exists. But the space it's sitting in doesn't have an address. She stood. That's not how null zones work. Null zones erase residue. They don't relocate geometry. Fern wrote that down. 3 words: geometry, not erased. Then she looked at the stone again, sitting on open ground in plain sight, its tracking signal clear and its position meaningless. "Something is maintaining that space," she said, "actively. This isn't a natural formation or a collapsed structure. There's deliberate architecture here." Frieren picked up a second stone. She had brought several, which suggested she had anticipated needing more than one attempt, and this time she inscribed a different sigil. Fern recognized it, a resonance marker, the kind used to detect whether 2 points in space were connected by an underlying channel. She rolled it after the first. It stopped in the same place. The resonance reading came back positive. Fern stared at the slate for a moment. "There's a channel. There's a destination," Frieren corrected. "Something on the other side of that boundary is anchoring the space. The stones aren't lost. They're somewhere specific." She brushed her hands clean. "The people who went in aren't lost either. They're somewhere specific too." Behind them, at a distance that suggested she had been there for some time, without announcing herself, Sari said, "Then we have been treating this as a disappearance when we should have been treating it as a border crossing." Neither Fern nor Frieren turned around. It was the kind of observation that didn't require acknowledgement. It required adjustment. The figure appeared at the edge of the cleared perimeter at dusk on the roadside, which meant it had come from the direction of Nazarick and not from any position within the camp's line of sight. No one had seen it approach. The perimeter detection threads registered nothing. No mana signature, no physical disturbance, no alert. One moment the road was empty. The next moment it was not. She was tall with dark hair and a white garment that caught the last of the evening light. 2 horns curved from her temples. Her hands were empty. She walked to a point approximately 20 meters from the nearest detection thread and stopped there in the middle of the road and waited with the patience of something that did not need to hurry. The camp went still. Not panicked, Sari had issued very clear instructions about panic, but still in the way of people who have collectively decided that the next move is not theirs to make. No one cast first, not with 9 lives somewhere beyond the road. It was Holt who walked out to meet her, because Holt was the ranking officer on the perimeter and the instructions covered this scenario in one line. If contact is initiated from the other side, receive it formally and report immediately. Holt had written that line herself. Fern watched from beside the command tent close enough to hear if the wind was cooperative. It was not entirely, but she caught enough. The woman introduced herself without a title that translated cleanly. She spoke with the precision of someone who had prepared each sentence before opening her mouth, and saw no reason to deviate from the prepared text. She used the word association the way someone used a word they had learned recently and learned correctly, without hesitation, without approximation, as if she had known it longer than she had. Nazarick, she said, was not a threat to those who did not make themselves into one. The current arrangement, the perimeter, the sealed road, the missing personnel was not a hostile act. It was a consequence of trespass, handled with more restraint than trespass typically warranted. The missing personnel were alive. They would remain so. Contact through this channel was permitted under specific terms. Those terms would be provided once it was clear that the association understood the basic structure of the situation, that there was a structure, that it had a decision maker, and that the decision maker was not obligated to explain itself. Holt said something Fern couldn't catch. The woman's response was brief. Then she said clearly enough that the wind cooperated without being asked. "This road is closed. If you want your people back, you speak to us correctly. We will tell you what correctly means." She did not wait for a reply. She turned and walked back the way she had come, and the road was empty again before anyone had decided what to do with what she had left behind. Fern found Frieren sitting outside the sleeping tent afterward, looking at the sky with the expression she wore when she was not thinking about the sky. "She wasn't the decision maker," Frieren said. "No. Probably not the second one either." Frieren pulled her knees up slightly. The temperature had dropped with the light, and the campfires were the only warm thing for some distance in every direction. Whatever is running that structure sent a representative. A good one. She didn't give us anything we could use, and she didn't need to threaten us to make the situation clear. She paused. That's not something you do unless you've thought carefully about what you want the other side to understand before the real conversation starts. Fern sat down beside her. The grass was cold. "Sari will want to move toward contact," she said. "On their terms, if necessary." "Sari already knows she doesn't have a better option." Frieren tilted her head back. The stars over the northern borderlands were very clear, the way stars were when there was nothing warm enough nearby to blur them. "The question is what they want from the contact. Information probably. Territory possibly. They haven't asked for anything yet, which means they haven't decided what to ask for yet, or they already have it and haven't told us." Stark emerged from the tent behind them, carrying something that might have been tea, and sat down on Frieren's other side without comment. He handed her a cup. She accepted it. "The woman with the horns," he said. She wasn't nervous. "No," Frieren agreed. "People who aren't nervous when they're outnumbered are either very confident or very certain that the numbers don't matter." He looked toward the road, which was dark and empty and gave nothing away. "Which one was she?" Frieren drank her tea. "Both, I think, but the second one more." The camp settled around them into the particular quiet of a place that had received important information and not yet decided what it meant. Somewhere near the supply line, 2 analysts were still awake, their lamp making a small yellow rectangle in the dark. The boundary marker was invisible at this distance, just an orange strip on a wooden stake somewhere in the shadow of the hills. The stones were still out there too, sitting on level ground, their signals readable. Their location a question the map had no answer for. Fern thought about the channel the resonance marker had found and what was on the other side of it, and how carefully the woman with the horns had chosen every word she'd released into the cold evening air. "We will tell you," what correctly means. Not a threat, a curriculum. She decided she did not find that reassuring and went inside to sleep before she could think about it any further. The meeting point was not chosen by the association. That was the first thing Fern noticed. The location had been indicated in a second message, delivered the same way as the first, by a figure that appeared on the road at dawn and was gone before anyone could ask a follow-up question. A clearing 300 meters east of the boundary marker, accessible from the camp, without crossing the affected area, with enough open ground that no one could approach from cover without being seen from both sides. Tactically neutral. Operationally specific. Whoever had selected it understood the terrain better than the camp's own surveyors. Sari examined the indicated coordinates on the map for approximately 10 seconds before folding it. We send 4 people. No weapons array, no detection equipment beyond personal slates, no active spells. Anyone who initiates an offensive cast without my direct order will answer to me afterward, not before. She looked around the briefing table. There won't be an afterward if you make that mistake, but the principle stands. She chose Holt for logistics, Fern, because she had asked a correct question the previous day and permitted Frieren and Stark to attend on the grounds that excluding them would cost more than it saved. Frieren accepted this without comment. Stark asked if he could bring his axe. Sari told him he could carry it, as long as he treated it as luggage. He seemed to find this a reasonable compromise. They reached the clearing at mid-morning. It was exactly as described, open dry, ringed by scrub pines that offered shade without concealment. A low flat stone near the center served apparently as the only furniture. Albedo was already there. She stood to one side of the stone with her hands clasped in front of her, wearing a white garment that was not designed for weather and seemed unconcerned about this. She was not alone. 2 figures stood further back at the tree line, still enough to be decorative rather than threatening. Fern cataloged them and looked away. Whatever they were not the conversation. Albedo's attention moved across the group with a methodical quality, the way a skilled administrator assessed a room before deciding how much of it mattered. It paused on Sari for 3 seconds, on Frieren for 4. Then it settled into a middle distance that addressed everyone equally and no one specifically. "Thank you for coming," she said in a tone that did not require gratitude to be reciprocated. Sari's response was immediate. "What are you—" A brief pause. Not surprise calculation. A representative. Of what? Of a structure that now shares a border with your jurisdiction. Albedo unclasped her hands and folded them differently, a small shift, the kind that preceded a prepared statement. "I am here to establish the terms of that border, not to negotiate them." Fern kept her face still. Not to negotiate. She wrote nothing down because she was not holding anything to write with. But the sentence arranged itself in her memory with the precision of something she suspected she would be quoting later. Sari let the distinction land without reacting to it. "Then deliver them." Dada. Albedo spoke for less than 4 minutes. She did not raise her voice. She did not gesture toward the tree line or reference whatever capabilities Nazarick possessed. She presented each condition in the same register flat, complete non-negotiable in phrasing, if not explicitly in word, and allowed a pause between each one that was just long enough to confirm it had been received. The boundary was closed. No personnel, no probes, no equipment crossed it without explicit permission granted in advance through the designated channel. The channel was this one representative unarmed at the indicated location at a time requested with 48 hours notice. The missing personnel were alive and in adequate condition. They would be returned when the association demonstrated sustained compliance with the boundary terms. The timeline for that demonstration was not fixed. It would be determined by behavior, not by negotiation. Any attempt to breach the boundary by force, by misdirection, or by technical circumvention would be treated as a hostile act. the response to a hostile act would not be proportional. It would be sufficient. When she finished, the clearing was quiet in the way clearings sometimes were when a large animal had recently passed through. Sari said, "I don't need to understand your structure today. I need to know whether compliance stops the disappearances." "It already has," Albedo replied. "No one has entered the boundary in 4 days. No one has disappeared in 4 days." A pause that belonged to Sari. "And if someone enters without authorization, then they will have crossed a boundary." Albedo's tone did not shift. What happens to people who cross boundaries is consistent with what has already happened. We have not changed our methods. Frieren watched Sari absorb this. The older woman's face gave nothing away. Not capitulation, not outrage, not the particular kind of recalculation that showed in the eyes when a person was updating their threat model. She was simply very still in the way of someone who had already made her decision and was now managing the distance between that decision and the room. "Frieren," Sari said without looking at her, "anything you want to ask." It was not phrased as a question, which meant it was not optional. Frieren had been standing slightly apart from the group, watching Albedo with an expression Frieren associated with her examination of unusual spell structures, not hostile, not wary, simply measuring. "The people on your side of the boundary," Frieren said. "They entered a space that our instruments can't locate. Your representative used the word control when describing their status. That's a precise word." Albedo met her gaze directly. "It was chosen carefully. I know." Frieren tilted her head slightly. "What I'm asking is whether that precision is descriptive or contractual. Whether you're telling us what is true or what you're committed to keeping true." The pause that followed was the longest one in the conversation. Frieren wasn't certain Albedo had encountered that particular distinction before, or rather, she was fairly certain Albedo had encountered it, but perhaps not from someone who looked like Frieren and spoke as if she had been asking that kind of question for a very long time. "Both," Albedo said finally. "The current state is, as I described. Maintaining it is a decision, not an automatic condition. The decision will hold as long as the terms hold." Frieren nodded once. She did not look satisfied exactly, but she looked as though she had received the answer she had actually asked for, which was different. Sari said, "Then we have the terms." She did not extend a hand. Albedo did not appear to expect one. "We'll communicate through the designated channel within 48 hours. 48 hours, Albedo confirmed. She unclasped her hands. "One more thing." She produced from somewhere about her person a small sealed document. Not a scroll, not a slate. Something that resembled a formal letter in a language Frieren recognized as the one in common use across the Northern Territories. A list of behaviors that constitute compliance for your administrative records. She set it on the flat stone and stepped back. Sari picked it up without examining it. "You've been operating in this region for some time," she said. "You know our record-keeping conventions." "We know a great deal about your record-keeping conventions," Albedo replied pleasantly. Then she inclined her head and walked back toward the tree line, and the two figures there turned with her, and the three of them moved into the shadow of the pines and were not visible after that. The walk back to camp took longer than the walk out, though the distance was identical. No one spoke for the first half of it. Frieren walked beside Frieren and did not ask the question she was turning over until the camp's perimeter flags were visible ahead. "She knew our filing system," Frieren said. "Yes. They questioned the missing personnel. At minimum." Frieren's staff clicked against a root crossing the path. "Probably more than once. Probably several of them." and they used that information to format a document we'd accept as official. Which means they weren't only asking about mana systems and chain of command. Frieren paused. They were asking about how we think, how we organize. What makes something feel legitimate to us? Fern let that settle for a few steps. That's a different kind of intelligence. Yes, it's the kind you collect when you're planning to stay. Behind them, Stark had been quiet since the clearing. He spoke now without particular urgency. There was a courier waiting at the tree line, on their side. I saw him leave when the meeting ended north, not into the boundary area, toward the ridge. Fern and Frieren both turned to look at him. He wasn't one of theirs, he added. Wrong livery, wrong bearing. He was just watching. Fern looked toward the ridge. It was empty now, just pine and stone and the flat gray sky of a northern afternoon. She thought about the courier, about who sent watchers to observe a negotiation between parties that weren't them, and what conclusions those watchers would carry home, and how quickly conclusions of that kind traveled when they were interesting enough. Something else was paying attention to this border. Something that had decided the existence of Nazarick was information worth the cost of a courier. She filed this under things to report to Sari immediately and walked faster.
Okay, but can we talk about how Albedo completely owned that meeting? She walked right up to the strongest mages and basically told them they had zero power here. The craziest detail to me was when she handed over that official record document. She did not just question the missing guards, she learned the whole legal filing system just to mock them. That is next level petty, and I am totally here for it. How would you react if someone pulled up on you with your own paperwork? I don't know too, but before that, please wait until you see the crazy curse they find next.
The demon delegation arrived on a Wednesday, which was the kind of detail Fern noted because it grounded things in time, and time had begun to feel slippery in the northern camp. 3 of them moving along the road from the east in a formation that was not quite military and not quite casual. The practiced looseness of people who wanted to appear relaxed and had thought about it too carefully. They stopped at the outer perimeter checkpoint and asked politely to speak with whoever was in charge of the boundary situation. The checkpoint mage on duty, a woman named Brecht, who had been doing this job for 6 years and had encountered demon delegations twice before, did not reach for her slate. She told them to wait and went to find Holt. Holt told Sari. Sari came to look at them from behind the supply tent at an angle that gave her a full view without placing her in theirs. She studied them for perhaps 30 seconds. They're not here to fight, she said to no one in particular. They're here to measure. Fern, standing 2 steps behind her, had reached the same conclusion by a slightly different route. The delegation's leader, a tall figure in layered gray with the characteristic bone-pale complexion of the northern demon clans, was watching the boundary area with the focused patience of someone cataloging information rather than selecting targets. His companions were similarly occupied. One had turned slightly to observe the camp's detection threat arrangement. The other was looking at the road itself at the point where the orange marker stake was just visible in the distance. They were in the most technical sense doing exactly what the association had been doing for the past week. They were trying to read something that wasn't giving them a signal. "Do we receive them?" Holt asked. "We receive them," Sari said. "Formally, in the open. No one moves toward the boundary while they're here, and no one gives them a reason to think we're inviting a demonstration of anything." She turned away from the supply tent. "Fern, you're taking notes." Turned out, the conversation lasted 40 minutes and produced very little information that was not already available to both parties. The delegation's leader introduced himself by a rank title that translated approximately as assessor. Not a military designation, Fern noted, but an administrative one. He expressed measured interest in the anomaly at the northern border. He asked 3 questions about its origin, its behavior, and the association's current posture toward it, all of which were phrased as requests for information the association might voluntarily offer, and all of which Holt declined with the same formality they had been offered. He did not press. He shifted instead to an offer the demon clans of the Eastern Ridge had encountered boundary anomalies before he explained of a different nature but comparable disruption. They had methods. Perhaps an exchange of technical knowledge would serve both parties. Sari, who had joined the conversation 3 minutes in, listened to this with visible patience and then said, "We'll consider any formal proposal you submit through standard interjurisdictional channels. Currently, those channels are functioning." The assessor absorbed this. He glanced briefly at a Frieren who had positioned herself at the edge of the meeting group with no particular expression and had not spoken, and then at the boundary marker in the distance, and then back at Holt. "You have personnel inside," he said. It was not a question. "We have personnel unaccounted for," Holt replied. "A distinction without much practical weight from where I'm standing." He tilted his head slightly. The structure beyond that marker it moved in without announcement. It contains your people. It has set conditions. A pause measured to land correctly. "In our experience, structures that behave this way are either very desperate or very certain. The desperate ones can be negotiated with given sufficient pressure." The implication of the second category hung in the air without being completed. Fern kept writing. She had filled half a page. It was Frieren who spoke without moving from where she stood. "You came here to find out which kind this is." The assessor looked at her for the first time with full attention. "Among other things." "You won't find out from us. We don't know yet either." Frieren's voice carried the mild quality it had when she was stating something simple that other people had been making complicated. "But you came down the Eastern Ridge Road, which means you passed the courier relay point at the junction. Anything you've learned here will move faster than you will." A silence that was different in texture from the previous ones, less calculated, more genuine. "You're suggesting we already have an audience," the assessor said. "I'm observing that information about unusual border situations tends to travel." Frieren glanced at the tree line to the east, the same direction Stark had noted the previous day. Who it travels to is usually more interesting than the information itself. The assessor studied her for another few seconds. Then he looked at the boundary marker one final time, with the expression of someone filing a number they hadn't expected. He thanked the association for its time, which Holt acknowledged, and the delegation retraced their path toward the east checkpoint with the same studied looseness they had arrived with. It took them longer to leave than it had taken them to approach. They were still measuring on the way out. And 20 minutes after the delegation crossed back through the eastern perimeter, something happened at the boundary. Fern was at the map table when the alert came in. Not a sound, not a visible flash. Just a sudden update on 2 of the passive detection threads circling closest to the orange marker stake. Not a breach, a pressure. As if something on the other side had applied force to a specific point in the boundary area, held it for approximately 4 seconds, and withdrawn. The delegation had not gone east. Or rather, part of it had. One member, the companion who had been studying the road surface, had looped south and approached the boundary on foot from a different angle, while the formal group occupied the checkpoint. He had gotten within 40 meters of the marker before applying what Fern's slate now showed as a low-level disruption pulse, the kind used to test whether a barrier had passive response triggers. He had gotten an answer almost immediately. She did not see what came out of the boundary area. By the time she reached the perimeter, it was already over. What she saw was the demon alone now. His companions, nowhere in evidence, moving away at a pace that was not running, but was the thing that happened just before running became necessary. His left arm was held close to his side. There was frost on his sleeve. The boundary marker stake was exactly where it had been. The orange cloth strip moved in the wind. Holt appeared beside Fern. "One of ours?" "No." Detection thread picked up the pulse. Whatever responded came from the other side. They both looked at the frost on the retreating figure's arm. It was the kind of frost that formed on metal left in a cold room overnight. Comprehensive structural, not a surface effect. "He's keeping the arm still," Fern said. "Yes, because moving it might break something." Holt said nothing for a moment. Then, "The other two in the delegation, they didn't come back for him?" "No." Fern watched the figure reach the tree line and disappear into it. They knew what he was doing. They left him the exit route and went ahead to use it. She thought about the assessor's phrase, desperate or certain. She thought about 4 seconds of response time frost that reached bone depth and a boundary that had not moved a centimeter in either direction. Then she went to write a report because Serrier would want it in the next 10 minutes and because writing things down was the only way to keep them from taking up too much space in her head. Frieren was waiting outside the report tent when Fern emerged, leaning against a post with her arms folded and the staff propped beside her, apparently watching a bird navigate the camp's supply line with professional interest. "The delegation will report that the boundary is actively defended," Fern said. "Yes, and that the response is fast, cold, and precise, which tells them the defender has patience and method." Frieren watched the bird locate what it wanted and depart. Patience and method are harder to outlast than anger. Anger makes mistakes. Method just waits for you to make one. Fern tucked the report under her arm. "Sari will want to know if the demon clans are likely to escalate." "They won't. Not directly." Frieren finally looked away from where the bird had been. "They came to measure, and they got a measurement. It wasn't the measurement they hoped for, but it was accurate. Demons in this region are pragmatic. They don't spend resources on fights they've already calculated the outcome of." "Then who does..." Frieren considered this with the particular patience she applied to questions that had answers she didn't entirely want to give. People who feel that the calculation is wrong, or people who weren't part of it. She pushed off the post and picked up her staff. "The courier Stark saw yesterday wasn't Demon Clan. Wrong livery." "I know. Someone else measured this border before the demons arrived. They just haven't shown us yet what they intend to do with what they found." The camp moved around the mages on rotation supply transfers, the distant hum of the communication relay being run through its evening check. Normal operations maintained with the discipline of people who had decided that normal was a choice they were making deliberately. Fern looked north toward the hills, toward the marker stake, and the frost that had already melted off a retreating arm somewhere in the eastern pines. Whatever had reached through that boundary and made its point in 4 seconds had not pursued. It had returned to where it came from and resumed waiting with a steadiness that was, as she was increasingly certain, entirely intentional. That was the detail that stayed with her. Not the speed, not the cold. The fact that it had stopped. The object arrived at the eastern checkpoint on a Thursday morning wrapped in oilcloth and carried by a demon courier who handed it over with the professional detachment of someone delivering correspondence rather than evidence. The accompanying note, written in the common script and unsigned, read, "Found at the Greywater Crossing 4 days east." Thought the association might want to examine it before anyone else did. Holt brought it to Sari unopened. Sari looked at the oilcloth for a moment, then called for Frieren. Frieren unwrapped it in the command tent with Fern beside her and 3 senior analysts standing far enough back to be plausibly uninvolved. Inside the cloth was a section of iron gate hinge, a common piece of construction hardware, the kind used on barn doors and storage sheds across the Northern Territories. About half of it had been converted smoothly and completely into gold. Not coated, not plated. The iron had become gold at a molecular level, the transformation clean and without seam at the boundary between the two materials. The gold portion retained the exact shape and surface texture of the iron it had replaced. If you did not look at the color, you would not have known anything had changed. Frieren studied it for a long time without touching it. "Diagoldze," she said. The analysts at the back of the tent became very still. "You've seen this before," Fern said. "I've seen the result before. Once, a long time ago, in a region that had a mocked problem." Frieren set the oilcloth down beside the hinge without picking the object up. The spell doesn't feel like a spell. It doesn't register on detection slates, doesn't interact with standard defensive arrays, doesn't produce residue you can track or measure. You don't know it's there until it's already happened. She straightened. "The only reason this piece is useful is because whoever sent it to us had the sense to stop touching it before the transformation completed." Sari, who had been standing by the tent entrance without speaking, said, "How far does it spread?" "Depends on contact. Direct sustained contact spreads it faster. Indirect contact through tools, through clothing, through anything that bridges the gap, spreads it slower but doesn't stop it." Frieren glanced at the hinge one more time. "The iron that's still iron is fine. Whatever was touching the iron that became gold is the question." "The barn the hinge came from," Holt said. "Would be worth checking." Frieren moved toward the tent entrance. "Don't send anyone who plans to touch anything with bare hands." Vincent hit the barn. When a suited survey team reached it 2 days later, was empty of livestock and contained 3 additional transformed objects: a bucket handle, a section of chain, and a portion of the wooden floor beam where the chain had rested. The wood-to-gold transition was less complete than the iron partial patchy, as if the transformation had found the material less cooperative, but it was present. The family that had owned the barn had relocated themselves 2 weeks prior, which Fern found both reassuring and deeply informative. They had not reported the incident. They had simply left taking their animals and their portable valuables and moved in with relatives in the next village. When a survey mage interviewed them, the eldest son said they had not known what to call what they had seen and had decided that calling it anything was worse than not calling it. Fern wrote that down verbatim and underlined it. The survey report reached the command tent on a Saturday, and Sari read it with the focused attention she gave to things that confirmed what she had already decided. She had already expanded the eastern perimeter markers by 1 kilometer. She had already issued a standing order that any objects showing metallic discoloration in the affected region be reported and not moved. She had already sent inquiries to 3 chapter houses with historical records on Macht's movements and territories. "The timing," Fern said when Sari set the report down. "The hinge conversion started approximately 3 weeks ago based on the family's account. That's before Nazarick appeared at the northern border. So they arrived into a region that already had an active Diagoldze problem. Or they were already aware of it." Fern paused. "Either way, they've been operating here with the knowledge that the Eastern Territories have a curse-type hazard that doesn't interact with standard assessment tools. And they built their risk protocols before we knew to ask about it." Sari's expression did not change in any way that would have been visible to anyone who did not know how to read the specific quality of her stillness. "You're saying their containment procedures account for Diagoldze-type vectors?" "I'm saying their containment procedures exist, which is more than most organizations can claim after 3 weeks of exposure." Fern closed her notebook. "I think they've been here longer than 3 weeks." In the operational chamber, Ainz stood at the edge of the table where Demiurge had laid out the current threat assessment and tried to remember the last time he had encountered something that made him feel this specific variety of careful. The curse sample they had detected at the eastern approach picked up not by any conventional detection method, but by the residual interaction between the transformation field and a summoned entity Aura had deployed as a perimeter scout was not a problem he could solve. He knew that. He had understood it within 10 minutes of Demiurge's briefing. Diagoldsy class effects operated outside the parameters of any countermeasure in his available toolkit. Dispel attempts interacted with nothing because there was nothing to interact with. Barriers blocked contact vectors but did nothing about the underlying transformation once it had initiated. What he could do was exactly what he had always done. When confronted with a threat he couldn't neutralize, he could prevent it from touching anything that mattered. Aura, he said, expands the summoned perimeter buffer to 200 meters east of the current boundary. Anything that enters that zone is cataloged and removed from the zone before it makes contact with the inner perimeter. The removal agents are disposable summons, only nothing with permanent status, nothing irreplaceable. He looked at Demiurge. If the transformation propagates through a summon, the summon is dissolved before it returns. We treat the zone as a clean room, not a battleground. Demiurge inclined his head. And if the source approaches the perimeter directly, then it approaches a buffer of expendable assets and gets no further. Ainz turned back to the map. We are not in the business of countering things we don't understand. We are in the business of ensuring they don't reach us while we develop understanding. Those are different operations. Albedo at the far end of the table said, "It may come to a direct confrontation eventually." Eventually is not today. Ainz studied the eastern approach markers. Today we don't give it contact with anything that matters. If it doesn't interact with our detection systems, then our detection systems are irrelevant, and we replace them with physical separation. Simple architecture. He straightened. Mayor, I want a terrain modification along the eastern buffer zone. Ditches elevation changes. Anything that slows foot travel without requiring active maintenance. The environment does the work. Mayor, who had been quiet in the corner of the room in the way he sometimes was, when he was already thinking several steps ahead, nodded without looking up from his notes. 2 days after the survey report, Frieren was outside the sleeping tent at first light when Frieren came and stood beside her, with no particular preamble. "They've changed the terrain," Frieren said. Frieren looked east. The light was flat and gray, and the distance was too great to see what Frieren was describing, but she had no reason to doubt her. "When? Last night. I heard it the way you hear a large spell settling." Frieren had both hands around a cup Frieren hadn't noticed her carrying. Not dramatic. Just the ground rearranging itself in specific places. Whoever did it knew where the Diagoldsy vector was entering from. They knew before we did. Yes. Frieren thought about that for a moment. They didn't warn us. No. Frieren drank from the cup. But they also didn't wait for us to figure it out and ask. They handled their side of the problem and didn't make it our problem to manage. She looked east at the pale horizon. That's a specific kind of discipline. It means they have enough confidence in their own containment that they don't need our cooperation to maintain it. Or they don't trust us to handle it properly. Both can be true, the cup lowered. What matters is what it tells us about how they make decisions. They didn't neutralize the curse. They prevented it from touching anything relevant to them. There was no counterspell, no dramatic intervention, just geography and patience. Frieren looked at the horizon too. Somewhere in that direction, the terrain had been quietly reshaped overnight by something that had no interest in announcing itself. The analysts are going to ask what the mechanism was, she said. The mechanism was engineering. Frieren's voice carried the mild weight of someone correcting a category error, which is harder to be afraid of than magic, but considerably more difficult to argue with. Inside the command tent, someone had already begun the morning briefing. Voices carried faintly through the canvas numbers. Distances updated perimeter readings, the camp's ordinary machinery running on schedule. Fern stayed outside a moment longer. She was thinking about the barn and the family that had chosen not to name what they had seen, and the very precise silence of an organization that had reshaped the ground east of its position without alerting anyone, without claiming credit, and without leaving anything behind that could be used to predict what it would do next. The sun came up over the northern hills. The marker stake's orange cloth caught the early light. Fern went in for the briefing.
This part actually gave me chills, guys. Turning a random barn door hinge into solid gold sounds cool until Frieren reveals it is an unstoppable curse. But the absolute best part is how the tomb forces handled it. They did not even bother fighting the magic curse. They literally just picked up the ground and changed the map overnight to keep it out. That is such a massive brain play.
The first broadsheet appeared in the market town of Velen on a Monday, pinned to the notice board outside the grain exchange, with the kind of deliberate placement that suggested someone had waited until the morning crowd was at its thickest. It was printed not handwritten, which meant a press, which meant money. And it asked in plain language that had been carefully calibrated to sound like plain concern why the association had sealed the northern road without telling anyone what was on the other side of it. The broadsheet did not accuse, it inquired. It wondered. It noted with expressions of civic interest rather than alarm that the sealed road had been the primary supply route for 4 villages and 2 logging settlements, and that the alternative routes added 3 days to every delivery cycle, and that certain categories of perishable goods had already increased in price by amounts the broadsheet listed in a column on the right side of the page. At the bottom, in smaller text, it mentioned that rumors of a golden hinge found near the Greywater crossing had not been confirmed or denied by any association spokesperson. By Thursday, 3 more towns had copies. Fern found one on the camp's own message board. Someone had pinned it there, either as a report or as a provocation, and had not left a name. She read it twice slowly, and then looked at the date on the print run header. This was printed before the survey team reached the barn, she told Sari. Sari took the broadsheet and read it with the expressionless efficiency she applied to administrative problems. The golden hinge information. The Barn family left 2 weeks ago. They didn't report it to the association. They didn't report it to anyone. Fern kept her voice level. The only way this information reached a printing press before our survey team filed their report is if someone was watching the barn before we were. Sari set the broadsheet on the map table face down, which was a small gesture but a deliberate one. She did not want it visible in the room. Who benefits from a frightened grain market? Someone who wants the association to act before it's ready to act. Or someone who wants the association to look like it's hiding something. And Sari moved to the window slit of the tent. Outside the camp ran its ordinary morning operations with a discipline that had become its default state. Both at once, ideally. Fern thought about the courier Stark had spotted at the tree line 2 weeks ago in livery that belonged to no faction she recognized. She thought about the delegation's assessor and the practiced quality of his questions. She thought about how information moved in the Northern Territories slowly, by official channels, quickly by market routes, and instantly by the network of small interests that ran underneath both. "I'll need the last 3 weeks of supply manifests for the camp," she said, "and the routing records for the courier relays east of here." Sari looked at her. "You think the distribution network is compromised? I think someone has been paying attention to our logistics for longer than we've been paying attention to theirs." In the operational chamber, Demiurge had been paying attention to their logistics for exactly 19 days. The supply chain analysis had been straightforward once he had the initial data, a minor administrative exercise, compared to the social architecture he preferred to work with, but useful as a foundation. 3 supply convoys over the past 2 weeks had been routed through a waypoint at the Kelmark Junction that added 4 hours to their travel time for no apparent geographic reason. At the Kelmark Junction, a merchant house operated a small transit depot. The merchant house had received 11 days ago a payment from a source that traced back through 2 shell intermediaries to a land-holding consortium in the Southern Territories with historical ties to a block of minor lords who had been vocal in council about the association's management of border regions. The consortium had also 7 days ago paid a printing house in Velen for an unspecified run of single-sheet documents. Demiurge considered this the way he considered most problems, as a structure with load-bearing points, some of which were more interesting than others. The consortium itself was not the interesting part. The consortium was a tool well-funded, politically useful, and sufficiently insulated that its principals could deny operational knowledge of anything the tool did. The interesting part was what the tool was being aimed at, and by whom, and whether that aim had been finalized or was still being adjusted. He brought this to Ainz in a briefing that lasted 12 minutes. Ainz stood at the map table afterward and looked at the distribution lines Demiurge had drawn without speaking for long enough that Albedo began to compose internally an interpretation of his silence that involved 17 strategic implications she planned to discuss with Demiurge later. Ainz was thinking about supply chains and how much he disliked them as mechanisms of power because they were slow and visible and always had a weak point someone else had already found. "Continue monitoring," he said when he had finished thinking. "Don't move on the intermediaries yet. I want to know who gives the order to escalate, not who carries it." Demiurge inclined his head with a particular quality of deference that indicated he had already anticipated this instruction and had prepared the next 3 steps accordingly. "Of course, Ainz-sama. Your foresight in this matter is, as always." "Yes," Ainz said, which was the fastest way to conclude that sentence. "Keep me informed." After Ainz left the room, Demiurge turned to Albedo. "He wants them to move first," Demiurge said with the quiet certainty of a man who had spent considerable time translating the silences of someone he regarded as operating on a plane of strategic abstraction he could only partially perceive. Albedo nodded. "He's letting the pressure build to the point where the principals have to act directly." "Exactly." Demiurge straightened his notes. "When they do, we'll have names." Neither of them considered the possibility that Ainz had meant exactly what he said, and nothing more. This was a recurring feature of their working relationship that Ainz had long since stopped trying to correct. The second development came from Stark, which was not where Frieren had expected it to come from. He had spent 3 days doing what he did when the situation called for presence rather than action. Walking the perimeter road, stopping at the checkpoint, talking to the guards in the way that did not feel like information gathering, but consistently produced it. He had a facility for this that Frieren had observed before and not entirely understood. People told him things because he listened with the kind of attention that felt to the person being listened to like being taken seriously rather than being assessed. On Thursday evening, he came to find her with a folded piece of paper and the expression he wore when he had learned something he wished he hadn't. "There's a group in Velen," he said. "They call themselves a civic association. They've been organizing meetings, public ones, in the square discussing accountability for the border closure. About 40 people at the last one, maybe more." He put the paper on the table. "The man who chairs the meetings is a retired garrison mage. Respected, local, completely genuine in his concern." Frieren unfolded the paper. It was a meeting notice printed on the same press as the broadsheet. Same typeface, same column layout. "He doesn't know he's being used," Stark said. "No, that's the point. Fern looked at the meeting schedule. 3 per week, escalating frequency. Who's attending besides local residents? That's the part I didn't like. There are people coming from outside Velen merchants, a few who look like hired labor, and at least 2 that the guards at the eastern checkpoint logged as passing through on commercial transit 6 days ago. He paused. They arrived before the broadsheets. Fern set the notice down beside the supply manifests she had been reviewing. The stack of paper on the table had grown steadily over the week, and each new document connected to at least 2 of the ones beneath it. The meetings aren't the objective, she said. They're the audience. Someone is building a constituency for an action they haven't announced yet. What kind of action? Fern thought about the consortium and the printing house and the people who had arrived before the information they were ostensibly responding to. She thought about 40 residents of Velen who were genuinely frightened about their supply routes and genuinely angry about the sealed road being organized by people who needed that anger pointed in a specific direction before it dispersed. The kind that requires public justification to look legitimate, she said. They need people who can say afterward that they acted because the community demanded it. Stark was quiet for a moment. Sari needs to know this tonight. Yes. He left to find her. Fern stayed with the documents and added Stark's paper to the stack and wrote a single line at the top of her notes. The broadsheets are not the message. They are the preparation for the message. She underlined it and went to make copies before the lamp oil ran out. Siri absorbed the full picture in one briefing, seated at the map table with the documents arranged in front of her in the order Fern had determined was clearest. She asked 4 questions, all of which Fern had anticipated and had answers for. Then, she was quiet for a moment. They want us to move first, she said. Either against Nazarick, which we cannot do effectively, or against the civilian meetings, which we will not do at all. The third option is to do neither and let the situation develop, which is what they're counting on us defaulting to. Sari stood. We don't default. We choose. She moved to the tent entrance and looked out at the camp and the dark hills beyond it. Holt, expand the patrol circuit around Velen. Visible presence, not enforcement. We are not suppressing a meeting. We are ensuring that whatever happens in Velen happens in front of witnesses. Holt, who had been standing by the entrance, said, and the supply chain, reroute through the southern pass. Longer, but clean. Sari turned back to the room. If someone has been using the Kelmark junction as an observation point, I want them to know we've noticed without us having to say it. Fern wrote this down. The rerouting would cost 4 days per supply cycle. It was the kind of cost that Sari had calculated before she announced it, because she did not announce things she hadn't calculated. Outside the camp settled into its night rotation. The lamp on the map table burned steady. The stack of documents cast a small, precise shadow. Somewhere east of the perimeter, along a route that had just been changed, a transit depot at the Kelmark Junction was going to receive significantly less traffic beginning tomorrow morning. And the people who monitored that traffic would need to make a decision about what to do next. Demiurge was counting on them making it quickly and badly, and in a way that required them to use a channel they had not previously used directly. He expected to have names by the end of the week. The contract was specific enough to seem professional and vague enough to seem deniable. The man who signed it called himself a regional coordinator for a civic recovery organization, which was the kind of title that existed in the space between legitimate grievance and deliberate misdirection. He wore a merchant's coat and carried a seal that traced back if you followed it 3 steps to the land-holding consortium that had funded the printing house in Velen. He did not explain this. He did not need to. The group he was hiring did not ask the kind of questions that required explaining. The mission as written: enter the affected zone at the northern border, document the structure inside and recover any personnel or materials that could be used to establish the association's liability for the border closure. Liability was underlined. The group's leader, a compact man named Osric, who had done 6 years of contract work in the Eastern Territories and had survived 2 situations that had killed everyone else who'd been there, read the contract twice and then asked about the exit protocol. The coordinator told him there was a weak point in the detection perimeter northeast of the main camp where the threads had been improperly anchored. He had a map. The map showed an approach route, a gap in the fence line, and an estimated 200 meters of open ground before the first permanent structure. Osric studied the map and said nothing for a long moment. The gap in the fence line was exactly the kind of error a tired camp makes when it has been running on rotation schedules for 3 weeks. The approach route avoided the 2 most obvious patrol patterns. The map had the particular quality of something that had been assembled from multiple sources by someone who knew what they were looking for. "How did you get this?" Osric asked. "Careful observation," the coordinator said, which was true in the way that most useful lies were true. Osric accepted the contract. He had 4 people with him, which was the right number for quiet work and the wrong number for anything that went loud. They moved out the following night. Fern found the gap in the fence line before they did. She had been running the northeast perimeter sweep at dawn, 3 days running, because the detection thread spacing in that sector had bothered her, since it was installed, not improperly anchored, but anchored with a slightly different tension than the surrounding sections, as if someone had adjusted it recently and then adjusted it back to almost right. She had mentioned it to Holt on the first day. Holt had flagged it for a maintenance check. The maintenance check had confirmed the threads were functioning within acceptable parameters. On the 3rd morning, she noticed that the tension had changed again overnight, and now the gap was exactly the size a careful person might decide was exploitable. She stood at the fence line in the early light and looked at the gap, and looked at the ground on the other side of it, which showed no footprints, because the frost had not yet melted, and whatever had made the adjustments had come from the other side. She went directly to Sari. "The gap is deliberate," she said. "Someone created it from inside the perimeter zone, not from our side." Sari looked at the sketch Fern had made of the tension readings. "They're inviting entry. They're creating the appearance of an exploitable error. Someone who was already looking for a way in would find this and believe they'd found it themselves." Fern paused. "I think there's already a group that's been pointed at it." "The coordinator from Velen," Sari said. It was not a question. Holt's expanded patrol circuit had been watching the town for 6 days, and the coordinator had been visible, if not legible. "If there's a group moving tonight, we can't stop them without showing our hand on the supply chain investigation. And if we move into the perimeter zone to intercept, we risk the con-tin." Sari folded the sketch and held it for a moment. "We let it proceed." Fern kept her face even. This was the correct decision, and she did not like it. If they're captured inside, then Nazarick has more leverage and more information than they had yesterday, and we have a clearer picture of who sent them. Sari set the sketch on the table. "We watch the exit. We record who comes out when and in what condition. That's our move tonight." Fern went to find Frieren. Frieren was already at the northeast perimeter when Fern arrived, sitting on a flat stone outside the thread line, with her staff across her knees and the expression she wore when she was listening to something that wasn't sound. "They're already inside," she said without looking up. "How long? An hour, maybe less." She tilted her head slightly. "The space changed." "Not the same way it changed before. This is smaller, more specific. Like a door opening and closing very quietly." Fern sat down on the ground beside her. The frost was still on the grass this far from the campfires, and the cold came up through her coat immediately. but she had learned to ignore that. Can you tell where they are? No. The geometry in there doesn't map outward. Frieren glanced at the gap in the fence line, which was still precisely the right size and the right shape. But I can tell you they haven't come back out. They waited. The sun cleared the eastern ridge and the frost began to soften. Somewhere in the camp behind them, the morning rotation changed over. A cook fire added wood smoke to the air. Ordinary things happening at their ordinary pace, while somewhere behind a fence line that didn't quite work the way it appeared to, 4 or 5 people were learning something about the space they had walked into. At the 2-hour mark, Frieren said, "They didn't find the door." "And what do you mean?" "They went in through the gap." But the gap closed behind them, not physically, not in a way they could see, but the space rearranged. The route they used to enter no longer connects to the entrance they came through. She looked at the fence line. They're still in there. They're just not in the same there they thought they entered. Fern absorbed this. She thought about the stone she had rolled along the ground 3 weeks ago. Stopping at the same point, regardless of force, its tracking signal readable, but its position unmappable. "Geometry," she said. "Architecture," Frieren corrected. "Very deliberate architecture. They're not lost. They're exactly where whoever designed that gap intended them to be." Inside, Osric knew something was wrong within 20 minutes of entry, which was 20 minutes faster than most of his clients' assessments would have credited him for. The structure was not what the map had suggested. The map had shown open ground and a building facade, utilitarian, defensible, the kind of thing a military encampment threw up quickly. What he found instead was a corridor, not physically narrow, but functionally narrow. Every direction that was not forward led back to a space that felt recently vacated, and every direction that was forward felt chosen rather than available. His mage, a capable woman who had spent 8 years doing ley line surveys, ran her detection slate continuously and reported the same thing, every 2 minutes functioning, reading clean, nothing to interact with. Her voice had taken on the particular flatness of someone who was managing the fact that her most reliable tool was not providing useful information and had decided to keep using it anyway, because stopping felt worse. The scouts came back from ahead and reported a chamber large, lit by a light source they hadn't identified, and empty except for a single figure at its center. Osric went forward to look. The figure was small, smaller than he'd expected from the scale of everything else, and appeared to float rather than stand, which was not something he could resolve into a conventional category. It didn't move as they entered. It didn't speak. It occupied the center of the chamber with the specific quality of something that was not waiting, not guarding, not threatening. It was simply present in the way that a cornerstone was present, structural load-bearing, not optional. His mage put her hand on his arm and said very quietly, "Don't touch it." He hadn't been going to. He was not sure why she felt the need to say it, except that the figure had a quality that made the instruction feel like it had arrived just in time. He turned to signal the retreat. The entrance they had come through was behind them. He could see it clearly, the corridor, the passage, the gap they had slipped through in the dark. It was all there, spatially accurate, visually correct. He walked toward it for 30 seconds without getting any closer. His mage made a sound he had never heard her make before, and he had worked with her for 3 years through circumstances that had generated most of the sounds a person could make. "The distance isn't real," she said. "The space between us and the exit is longer than the space we're standing in." Osric stood very still and thought about the contract and the coordinator and the map with its very specific gap, and decided that he had made at some point in the last 48 hours a significant professional error. He was not sure exactly which decision it had been. He suspected it had been the one where he had not asked a second question about how the coordinator had obtained the map. He sat down on the floor of the chamber and looked at the figure at its center, which had not moved, and waited to find out what happened next. What happened next from Demiurge's perspective was entirely satisfactory. The group of 5 had been separated by the spatial architecture into 3 subgroups before they reached the central chamber, a standard feature of the corridor design, which sorted by decision-making tendency rather than by physical capability. The 2 who had remained at the outer corridor were the most tactically cautious. The 2 scouts who had pressed forward were the most mission-focused. The leader and the mage had ended up in the chamber, which was where Demiurge wanted the decision-makers. By mid-morning, the preliminary assessments were complete. The scouts knew operational details, entry routes, patrol patterns. They had observed communication protocols for the handoff. The corridor group knew financial details, the payment structure, the intermediary accounts, the name of the man who had authorized the withdrawal, the leader who had been cooperative in the resigned manner of a professional who understood when a situation had moved past the point where a non-cooperation was rational, provided the coordinator's name, his organizational affiliation, and the name of the lord who had signed the underlying authorization. Demiurge reviewed this in sequence, cross-referenced it against the supply chain analysis from the previous week, and found that the 2 data sets connected at 7 points. 3 of those points were names he already had. 4 were new. He drafted a summary for Ainz that covered 2 pages and contained on the second page a list of the 4 new names and their relationship to the consortium's decision-making structure. The summary also contained 1 sentence that he had written last. After the rest was complete, because it was the kind of sentence that was more useful as a conclusion than as a preamble, we did not catch intruders. We caught a chain of authorization that was previously invisible. He considered this accurate and let it stand. Friern's log for that day contained a single short entry written at dusk after the northeast perimeter gap had been quietly restored to a tension that matched its neighbors, and the morning's events had finished producing their paperwork. 5 people went in. None came out. No bodies, no blood, no indication of violence. From outside, the zone looks exactly as it did yesterday. The gap in the fence line is no longer exploitable. No one on this side did anything to close it. She read this back and added 1 more line. The consortium sent them to find what Nazarick was hiding. They found that Nazarick had been waiting for them to arrive. She closed the log. Outside, the camp was preparing for another night rotation, and somewhere east of the perimeter, the supply reroute through the southern pass was completing its 2nd day, and the Kelmark Junction Transit Depot was running at significantly reduced capacity, and whatever decision the people monitoring that depot were going to make, they had not made it yet. But they would. Demiurge had been very precise about the timeline. The evening was cold and still, and the marker stake's orange cloth hung without moving in the windless air. In Velen, a civic meeting was scheduled for that night that would be attended by 43 residents and 6 people who had arrived before the information they were ostensibly responding to. 2 of those 6 were going to find upon attempting to contact their coordinator after the meeting that his communication channel had gone silent. They would report this upward. The reply, when it came, would use a channel that had not been used before. That channel had an address. The address had a name attached to it. Demiurge was looking forward to the name. The siege camp went up over 3 days, which was fast for the scale of it and slow for the urgency everyone claimed to feel. Frieren counted the tents from the eastern ridge on the 2nd morning 47 Military 11 Command, and a sprawling collection of civilian structures at the rear. That suggested the operation had attracted followers who were not entirely sure what they were following. The banner at the center belonged to Lord Caven of the Southern Territories, the same lord whose name appeared 2 steps removed in the consortium's authorization chain. He had brought 200 soldiers, a siege engineer, and a battle mage, who had apparently not been told that the structure they were besieging had no walls that conventional siege equipment was designed to address. At the perimeter checkpoint, Holt cataloged the arrivals with the expression she wore when she was doing arithmetic on a problem she already knew the answer to. "They're not unified," she told Sari that evening. "Cavan wants the road reopened. He has merchant contracts that have been running at a loss for 5 weeks. The battle mage block wants a formal engagement to establish precedent for magical jurisdiction. The civic groups from Velen want their missing people back, which is the only objective that makes sense to anyone who doesn't have a political position to defend." She set down her notes. "And there are approximately 30 men at the rear who appear to have been hired, lost their contractor in the last week, and decided to stay because they had nowhere else to go." "The contractor?" Sari said. "The coordinator?" "Yes." Sari looked at the map for a moment. The siege camp's position was marked in a red outline that Holt had added that afternoon. It sat between the association's perimeter and the Eastern Ridge Road, which meant that if the situation deteriorated rapidly, there were exactly 2 directions the camp could retreat toward, and one of them was the direction nobody wanted to go. "They're going to move within 48 hours, Sari said, "before they have time to agree on what they disagree about." "My estimate as well. Then we have 48 hours to not be in front of them when they do." The warning came from Malbedo at dawn the following day, delivered to the siege camp's command tent by a single courier who wore Nazaric's insignia and whose bearing suggested he had spent considerable time practicing how to enter a hostile camp without appearing to notice it was hostile. The message was 3 sentences. "Withdraw beyond the eastern marker. Do not approach the boundary again. This offer will not be repeated." Lord Cavan read it twice, and then looked at his battle mage, whose name was Tervain, and who had a reputation for careful thinking that he was currently in the process of abandoning under the combined pressure of a public reputation for boldness and the fact that 40 of his colleagues were watching him read a 3-sentence warning from an entity they had collectively decided they could afford to confront. "They're bluffing," said the Lord, who had been losing money for 5 weeks. Tervain said nothing, which was Fern noted from her position at the association's observation post on the ridge, the correct response, and one that was going to be ignored. What happened instead was a negotiation that lasted 6 hours and produced ultimately a compromise that satisfied no one's actual interests. They would advance to the boundary marker and stop, which was technically not a crossing, and demand the return of the missing personnel and the 5 infiltrators from the previous week, and see what happened. What this meant in practical terms was that 200 soldiers, 1 battle mage, and a siege engineer with equipment sized for castle walls were going to walk up a road toward a boundary that their own detection instruments couldn't read in a formation designed for conventional engagements to make a demand of an entity whose response time in the previous week had been measured in seconds. One group did not advance. The 23 militiamen from the Velen Civic Association, who had come because they genuinely wanted their missing neighbors returned and had no political investment in Lord Cavan's merchant contracts, looked at the advance formation and looked at the boundary and walked back to their tents. Their commander left a note with Holt's checkpoint saying they would wait for a negotiated outcome and asking to be informed if one became available. Fern wrote this down. It was the only decision made that morning that she found professionally respectable. The advance reached the boundary marker at mid-afternoon. Fern was at the ridge observation post with Frieren and Stark far enough back to have a full view and close enough that she did not need field glasses. The formation looked competent from a distance, evenly spaced. The battle mage positioned at the rear where he could work without being exposed. The scouts running wide on both flanks. Someone in that army had done this before in a context where it had worked. The marker stake stood in the road with its orange cloth. Nothing visible happened for approximately 2 minutes. Then the ground moved. Not an earthquake, the motion was too precise for that, too deliberate. A section of earth, approximately 40 meters wide and 20 meters deep, beginning at the boundary line and extending outward toward the advance formation, simply rose. The angle was shallow, almost gentle, as if the ground had decided to become a ramp rather than a wall. But the scale of it, the mass of earth and stone displacing in a single coherent motion, produced a sound that Frieren had no good comparison for. Not an explosion. Something slower and much larger. The formation's left flank broke first, which was where the scouts were, because the scouts were the ones who understood most quickly what the change in ground level meant for their position and had the least investment in standing still. The center held for perhaps 30 seconds longer, which was long enough for the siege engineer to register that his equipment was now on a slope it had not been designed for. Then Gargantua came through the tree line to the right. Frieren had read the word enormous in many field reports and had formed an abstract understanding of what it meant at military scale. The abstract understanding was not adequate. The figure that moved out of the trees was large, in the way that geological features were large. Its presence restructured the geometry of the field, the way a cliff restructured the geometry of a valley. It did not charge. It did not roar. It moved toward the advance formation at a pace that was entirely unhurried, and reached the nearest piece of siege equipment, a wheeled observation platform twice the height of a man, and removed it from the field with a motion that was from Frieren's position on the ridge, almost quiet. The wood made noise. The equipment made noise. The platform made noise as it came apart. After that, the field was very quiet, because the people who had been near the platform were running, and people who were running do not generally announce themselves. Gargantua stopped at the point where the formation had been. It did not pursue. It stood at the edge of the displaced ground and was still in the way of something that had completed a task and was waiting for the next instruction. The silence it occupied was different from the silence before it had appeared. The battle mage did not cast. Frieren noted this specifically because Tervain had a reputation, and the reputation included the phrase, acts under pressure. And he did not act. He watched the figure on the field for 4 seconds, and then issued a command to his unit that Frieren could not hear from the ridge, but could identify by its effect, an organized retreat moving at speed with no attempt to regroup or establish a secondary line. He had made a calculation. The calculation had taken 4 seconds. Frieren respected the speed of it. Nug. Syria issued the evacuation order for the association's forward camp at dusk, which was 12 hours earlier than her written contingency plan specified, because the contingency plan had been written before she knew what the field looked like at dusk. And the field at dusk looked like a place where decisions should be made sooner rather than later. "We're not retreating," she said to Holt and the 3 senior analysts and Frieren and Frieren and Stark in the briefing that lasted 9 minutes. "We are repositioning to a location where we can observe without being interpreted as a participant in whatever the remaining elements of Lord Caven's coalition decide to do next." "What are they likely to do next?" one of the analysts asked. Sari looked at him with the expression she reserved for questions she had already answered by implication. "What people who have been publicly humiliated and have lost their employer's investment and still have some resources left always do. They will look for something they can still damage." She looked at the map. The boundary zone sat at the top of it, marked in its red outline. South of it, the villages along the supply corridor. East, the rerouted trade road. West, the logging settlements that had been running short on materials for 5 weeks. "The question is not whether they act," she said. "The question is what they choose to act on." Frieren had been looking at the same map. She had been looking at it since the evacuation order came down. And the longer she looked at it, the more clearly she could see the logic of a faction that had no remaining path to a clean victory, and was therefore considering paths that did not require one. She said, "The supply depots. If they burn what they can't take and blame it on Nazarick, they reframe the loss as an atrocity instead of a defeat. The tent was quiet for a moment. Yes, Serie said. That is exactly what I would expect from someone who has run out of legitimate options. She closed the map. Which means we need Nazarick to understand what is about to happen on their doorstep before it happens, and we need that understanding on record, because in 72 hours, we are going to need to explain to a Council of Lords why the northern border looks the way it is going to look. She looked at Fern. You're going to the Channel. Tonight. 48 hours notice requirement waived by mutual necessity. Fern nodded. She did not ask how Sari planned to argue that the notice requirement had been mutually waived by an entity that had not agreed to waive it. Some problems resolved themselves if you moved fast enough. Frieren walked with her to the communication point and stood outside it, while Fern went in alone because the channel required one representative and Frieren had never been formally introduced to the other side. And this was not the moment to add variables. When Fern came back out, she had been inside for 11 minutes. Well, Frieren asked. They already knew. Fern pulled her coat tighter against the night air. The response was 30 seconds. They'd been tracking the coalition's rear elements since this afternoon. She paused. They thanked me for the notification and said they would handle their perimeter accordingly. Frieren looked toward the north, where the hills were invisible in the dark, and the boundary zone was indistinguishable from ordinary night. They came with an army, she said. They're leaving with a rule. The rule being that the army was never relevant. Frieren turned back toward the camp. Cavan's coalition had numbers and equipment and a jurisdiction argument and a public mandate. None of it mattered, because none of it was the right tool for this particular problem. Her staff clicked against the frozen ground. The people who are going to do something desperate next, they know the army didn't work. So they're going to try something that isn't an army. Fern thought about the supply depots and the logging settlements and the particular logic of people who had decided that if they couldn't win, they could at least ensure that nobody else could either. And Nazarick, she asked. Frieren was quiet for a few steps. Nazarick has been patient for 6 weeks. Whatever they decide next, they won't decide it in anger. She looked up at the dark sky. That's the most frightening thing about them, I think. They don't need to be angry to be thorough. The camp was a row of lights ahead of them, smaller than it had been that morning. The repositioning was already underway. Tents coming down, crates being loaded, the methodical compression of an organization that had practice at moving without losing its shape. Somewhere south of the boundary, in the wreckage of a siege camp that had lasted less than a day, a faction was making calculations about what they could still afford to destroy. Somewhere north of it, something was already waiting for them to finish calculating. Fern went to help with the tents.
Now, let's talk about an epic fail. That entire human army really thought they could just walk up and demand things. My jaw fucking dropped when that giant rock monster stepped out of the trees and casually crushed their huge siege weapon like it was a tiny toy. It did not even roar or attack the soldiers. It just did its job and stood there staring at them. I wonder if the human army ever stood a chance. Well, I am waiting for you guys' comments on this.
The first warehouse burned on a Tuesday night, which was the same day of the week as the first patrol had vanished, though no one in the northern camp was keeping track of that particular symmetry anymore. The fire was in Heron's Crossing, a settlement of 400 people 7 kilometers south of the association's repositioned perimeter. The warehouse held dried grain, preserved meat, and the medical supplies that had been rerouted through the southern pass over the previous 2 weeks. It burned completely in under an hour. The settlement's well was contaminated the following morning. Someone had dropped enough lime into it to make the water undrinkable for at least a week, and by noon, a family of 6 had been found on the eastern road, alive but beaten, their cart overturned and stripped. The family said they had been told by the men who did it that Nazarick had ordered it. Holt's report reached Sari's table before the family reached the association's relief station. Sari read it without expression. She had been reading reports with that particular absence of expression for 6 days since the siege camp had dissolved and its remaining elements had dispersed into the countryside to do the things that dispersed armies did when they had no more legitimate objectives. She had been counting the days until one of those things was irreversible. "How many settlements in the corridor?" she asked. 11 with significant food stores, 7 with medical caches. Holt's voice carried the flat quality of someone who had already done the arithmetic. "The pattern suggests they're working south to north. Heron's Crossing is the 3rd in the corridor. At the current rate, I know the rate." Sari stood. "Get me Fern." Biag. Fern had already drafted the communication to Nazarick's channel before Sari asked for her, because there was only one message worth sending and she had been composing it in her head since the second warehouse fire 4 days earlier. She delivered it herself alone at the designated location in the early morning before the dew had lifted. The response came in 40 seconds. She walked back to the command tent and gave Sari the text verbatim. Nazarick was aware of the corridor situation. They had been monitoring it since the first incident. They would act within 24 hours, and they recommended that the association clear the eastern road south of Heron's Crossing before noon. "Noon today," Fern said. "Yes." Sari looked at the clock on the field desk. It was 6 hours to noon. "Get everyone moving," she said. "Civilians first, then equipment, then personnel. Nothing we can't replace stays on that road." She did not ask what Nazarick intended to do. She had phrased the communication carefully to avoid asking, because asking would have created an obligation to respond, and a response would have created an obligation to approve or object. An approval was something she could not give, an objection was something she could not enforce. She had simply notified and received notification in return, and now she had 6 hours. It was, she reflected, the most honest diplomatic exchange she had conducted in 20 years. In the operational chamber, Ainz stood at the table and looked at the tactical map for approximately 2 minutes without speaking. The map showed the corridor, the 11 settlements, the road, the dispersed elements of the former coalition now operating as something that had no formal name and no unified command, but a coherent enough objective that it functioned like one. 3 warehouses, 2 wells, 1 atrocity attributed falsely to Nazarick. The attribution had already reached 3 trading posts and a regional council session. If it continued, the attribution would become the story. The story would create a justification. The justification would require a response. The response would produce a new story. The machine had a shape he recognized, and the shape was self-sustaining. "This is the last correction," he said. The phrase was not addressed to anyone specifically, which meant it was addressed to everyone in the room. After this, anyone who attempts to restart the cycle is doing so with the knowledge that there is no second last correction. That needs to be understood before we act, not after. Albedo inclined her head. She was already holding the instrument. "Understood, Ainz-sama." He looked at the map for one more moment. He was not angry. He had not been angry at any point in the 6 weeks since Nazarick had appeared in this world, which was itself a kind of achievement, given how many things had happened that might reasonably have produced anger. He was instead performing the same calculation he always performed when a situation had developed past the point where patience produced better outcomes than action, the arithmetic of what happened if he continued to wait versus what happened if he did not. The arithmetic was not close. "Proceed," he said. "Mas." Frieren was 2 kilometers south of Heron's Crossing at the edge of the evacuation zone when it happened. She was watching a column of roughly 80 people families, mostly with carts and bundled belongings, and the expressions of people who had been told to move and had moved without being given a reason. They found adequate move along the eastern road toward the relay station at Kelmark. The column was orderly. Holt had put 4 association mages on escort duty, which was enough to maintain order without making it look like a forced evacuation. The sound reached her before anything visible did. Not an explosion. She had heard enough field reports to know what those sounded like. This was lower, broader, the kind of sound that seemed to originate from the ground rather than travel through the air. It lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then a section of the eastern ridge, where the coalition's primary supply depot had been established in the ruins of a logging camp, was no longer the shape it had been. She could not see the depot itself from her position. What she could see was the dust rising in a column that was almost perfectly vertical in the still morning air, and the silence that followed the sound, and the way the column of evacuees had stopped walking without anyone giving an order to stop. After a moment, they started walking again, faster than before. Frieren watched the dust column until it began to disperse. She ran a sweep with her slate. The reading was clean, no residue, no interference pattern, no signature she could classify. Whatever had been used left nothing behind that her instruments could ask a question about. She lowered the slate and looked at the horizon. The logging camp had held, according to Holt's intelligence, enough munitions and supplies to sustain a low-level disruption campaign through the winter. It had also held, according to the same intelligence, approximately 30 people at any given time, of whom perhaps 8 had operational roles, and the rest were support. She did not know what had happened to the 30 people. She did not ask. She had learned over 6 weeks of operating adjacent to something that thought on a different scale than she was accustomed to, that some questions were more productive than others, and the productive ones were the ones that pointed toward what came next, rather than what had just occurred. What came next was 80 people who needed to reach Kelmark before dark. She went back to walking with the column. No. The Hyapoi's formal communique reached the Regional Council 11 days later, drafted by Sari and carrying 4 senior signatures. It described the current situation at the northern border in language that was accurate without being complete, established the terms of the existing communication protocol with Nazarick, and recommended that all jurisdictional claims to the affected territory north of the boundary marker be formally suspended pending further assessment. The language around further assessment was careful enough that it could mean anything from 6 months to indefinitely. Sari had written it to mean indefinitely and trusted the council to understand that without requiring her to say it. Lord Caven's merchant contracts were restructured through the Southern Pass. The restructuring cost him 12% of his annual margin, which was less than the siege had cost him, and considerably less than the winter disruption campaign had cost the settlements in his jurisdiction. He signed the restructuring agreement without objection, which suggested he had done arithmetic similar to Ainz's and reached a similar conclusion about what happened if he did not. The troop garrison at the eastern checkpoint was reduced by half and replaced with a smaller permanent monitoring station. The monitoring station had better equipment than the garrison had, and fewer people and a much cleaner mandate: observe and report, do not engage. In Velen, the Civic Association held its last meeting on a Thursday in early winter. The retired garrison mage, who had chaired the meetings, gave a brief address acknowledging that the situation had developed in ways he had not anticipated, and that the community's interests were best served by engaging with the association's formal protocols, rather than organizing independently. He was thanked, and the meeting was adjourned. The 6 outsiders who had been attending did not come to the final meeting. No one mentioned this. The supply corridor was resupplied over the course of 3 weeks. The contaminated well at Heron's Crossing was cleared and tested, and declared safe by the end of the month. The family whose cart had been overturned received a formal compensation payment from Lord Caven's estate, which was the outcome of a process that Sari had initiated and Holt had driven to completion with the efficiency she applied to processes that she had decided were going to complete, regardless of what obstacles they encountered. Demon Clan activity in the Northern Territories dropped sharply after the third week of winter. The assessor who had visited the association's camp in autumn filed a report with his own counsel that described the northern border situation in 3 words that translated approximately as already settled elsewhere. The eastern ridge routes were rerouted around the affected region. The rerouting added 2 days to most transit times and was accepted without public objection by anyone who had seen the dust column rise from the logging camp on a clear November morning. Frieren left the northern camp on a Wednesday in late autumn, which was 43 days after she had arrived, and approximately 39 days after she had understood what she was looking at. Fern had the horses ready, and Stark had already eaten, which was the standard departure configuration, and they were on the south road before the first checkpoint rotation changed over. At the edge of the monitoring station's range, where the northern hills were still visible behind them, Frieren stopped and looked back. The boundary zone was indistinguishable from the surrounding terrain. The hills sat the same way they had sat since before anyone walking this road had been born. The marker stake was still there. The orange cloth had faded considerably over 6 weeks of weather, and it marked the same point. It had always marked the place where the road continued, and the space it continued into was no longer entirely the association's concern. "Do you think they'll stay?" Stark asked. Frieren considered this with the patience she applied to questions that had long answers compressed into short ones. "They came from somewhere else, and they'll remain somewhere else. Whether that somewhere is here or not is a decision they haven't announced yet." She turned back to the road. "But they built infrastructure. You don't build infrastructure in a place you're planning to leave." They walked south. The road was ordinary frost on the grass. At the edges, wood smoke from a settlement visible ahead, a cart coming the other direction, driven by a man who nodded at them and did not stop. Ordinary things in an ordinary morning, in a region that had spent 6 weeks negotiating with something it did not have a category for, and had emerged from the process without a better category, but with a clearer understanding of what it meant to not have one. Fern pulled her coat against the cold. She had been thinking since the morning of the dust column about the way the whole situation had developed. Not the events themselves, but the shape of them. The logic that connected the first patrol vanishing on a Tuesday to the formal communique, and the restructured merchant contracts and the faded orange cloth on the marker stake. "The border wasn't guarded by soldiers in the end," she said. Frieren walked for a few steps before responding. "No. It was guarded by the understanding that testing it again had a known outcome." "Yes." Frieren's staff clicked against the frozen road. "That's what certainty does. It doesn't require presence. It just requires that everyone involved knows what presence means." Stark glanced between them. "Is that better or worse than soldiers?" "Depends on what you mean by better," Frieren said. "Soldiers can be beaten. Certainty can only be disproven." She looked at the road ahead, at the ordinary morning and the wood smoke and the cart driver who had not stopped. No one in that region is going to disprove it. Not this generation. Fern thought about Aldrich, the 4th-rank field mage who had answered questions about chain of command while sitting on a stone floor somewhere the map had no address for. She thought about the assessment that Demiurge had filed cross-referenced across 7 connection points leading to 4 new names. She thought about 80 people walking faster on a road, after a sound that seemed to come from the ground. She thought about Frieren rolling stones across a field in the cold to find out where the question ended. None of it had been a war. It had been a process of learning what kind of thing was on the other side of a border that had not previously existed conducted by two sets of people who were very different in almost every way and alike in exactly one. Neither of them was willing to move without understanding what they were moving into. The settlement ahead resolved into buildings. A dog ran out to inspect them and decided they were unremarkable. The wood smoke was coming from a bakery, and the smell of it was specific and warm and had nothing to do with politics or jurisdictions, or the particular silence that followed a 4-second sound. On a November morning, Stark bought bread. He offered some to Frieren, who accepted it. Fern declined and then changed her mind. They walked south into an ordinary day, away from a border that no longer needed anyone to stand at it. It knew what it was now. That was enough.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and be sure to turn on notification so you won't miss our future video. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.